Robbo's World Tonight is brought to you by the Mazda 626, so full of features, it eclipses the competition.
Who's meant to keep this clean, this desk? My desk. I feel like I've got DTs. I'm picking little... Any other program use this desk, do they?
No.
They don't?
No.
Has anything ever been done on this desk?
Not to my knowledge.
There's a rumour, you know, isn't there? I'll never go in that boardroom again. I got home last night and listened to my shortwave receiver, a little wire around my little tiny place out in the country. And I heard a report from the BBC where they said, and I wonder about the poignancy of this, they said, here's a message for all British people in Kuwait. Could you go to the so-and-so hotel where you'll be rounded up, I think was the term used, and the implication being that you'll be safe from then on. Please take a suitcase and take some food. And I was very much wondering about, remember when Mr. Chamberlain came back in about 38, was it? 1938 or early 39, he said, he waving a bit of paper saying, I've just chatted with Mr. Hitler and this is our agreement. I wondered because of the news of today. It was very poignant. In fact, I recorded it. And I did think that at the time. And then, of course, I came to work today. And guess what? There was deep concern today for the safety of foreign nationals being rounded up in Iraq. We'll have an expert's view on what has happened and what might happen in the Gulf. And the rioting and killing spreads as black factions battle in the townships of South Africa. Well, one of the advantages of being a dictator is that you can, of course, dictate. The rules are what you say they are. Well, as he tangles himself more and more in a push and shove battle with the Americans, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein is coming up with unpleasant new ideas every day. Today, he decided that all Americans and Britons in Kuwait should be gathered up. Australians were exempt from the order, but they're still at risk.
The ominous move was announced by Iraqi military authorities. 2,500 Americans trapped in Kuwait were ordered to the International Hotel, the 4,000 Britons to the Regency Palace. The Iraqi instructions and this obvious threat relayed here by the BBC Radio's World Service.
The Iraqis have stated that if the British community do not move voluntarily, they will face unspecified difficulties.
In London, the Iraqi ambassador was told that Britain considered the roundup a grave and sinister development.
I fear, I have no proof of this, but I fear that it is in preparation for moving those people somewhere else.
That fear was also expressed by one of the few Westerners lucky enough to make it to safety today.
One of the things when we were in Kuwait that we always feared was that there would be a roundup of Britons, and we were always dreading the knock on the door.
With the hotels that the thousands of Americans and Britons have been ordered to only having enough room for a few hundred people, it's Iraq's next step which worries analysts most. They could be moved to hotels in Baghdad. This has already happened to many other Westerners, but there are genuine fears they could be taken to Iraqi internment camps or placed near key Iraqi installations to deter any foreign attack. News of the roundup led to a rush by others to get out. Nearly 10,000 refugees poured across the border in Jordan today after travelling for days through Iraq from the trouble spot of Kuwait. They're Egyptians who told us they'd been working in the oil fields to build a better life back home. They kept their money in Kuwaiti banks, and once the Iraqis invaded, they lost the lot.
When the war started, nobody could get no money from the banks or anything, so a lot of them coming back to their country without no money at all.
And this is the scene that so depresses Australian government officials here at the desert border post. Thousands upon thousands of people are getting through here every day, mostly Arabs, but also Eastern Europeans and even some Filipinos. If you are an Australian carrying an Australian passport, you will get as far as that border post and no further. And closer to the Saudi border, a war alert today when the radar systems of US jets electronically locked onto Iraqi fighters. The Iraqis pulled out of their surveillance run without any incident. But America's superiority in the air is evident everywhere at the new US bases. The Patriot ground-to-air missile systems brought in yesterday, ending any concerns of vulnerabilities.
We will not start a war, but we will finish one quickly, I think, in the air.
Just go ahead and relax, drink plenty of water. Important, drink plenty of water.
For now, the only problem for the Americans is the heat, whether the air-conditioned tents are working properly and trying to find that elusive spot out of the scorching sun. Robert Penfold, World Tonight, Jordan.
One Australian couple have done what seems like the impossible. Tasmanians Mark and Karen Batcher-Carbis are now resting in Paris. These photographs proof of their dangerous escape across the Kuwait-Saudi border, using a sandstorm as cover.
I'll know how it feels in about 20 minutes' time when I open a can of Foster's.
It's a whole dislocation of your whole life.
But their story hasn't lessened fears for the other Australians still in the war zone. It's now believed that at least 70 Australians are in Baghdad and another 90 are in Kuwait, more than first thought. For the third time, the Iraqi ambassador was summoned to the Foreign Affairs Department to hear our increasing fears for Australians there.
They ask when they return. I don't know.
Anxiety over their safety's increased following today's Iraqi order to British and American nationals to assemble in central hotels in Kuwait. So far, no such directive has been issued to Australians.
I shall discuss with my government the problem if it happens. But I don't receive anything about that.
We are, however, very disturbed by this directive, particularly if it is a prelude to an internment exercise. The signs are ominous that something of this kind is in the Iraqis' mind.
Maintaining its links via a communications control room buried deep inside Foreign Affairs Canberra headquarters, the department's receiving its information from the Australian Embassy in Baghdad. For the Australians stranded in Iraq and Kuwait, information comes through Radio Australia's special service to the Gulf. Its recent broadcasts have warned them not to leave their homes. Prime Minister Hawke continued his visit to northern New South Wales today, where he used some of his strongest language yet, condemning those who wanted to appease Saddam Hussein.
That there should have been two Nuremberg trials. There should have been the trials of the Nazis, and there should have been the trials of the appeasers. Because without both of them, you couldn't have had the Second World War.
A very obvious dig at groups like the one he met today, protesting the decision to commit Australian ships to the Middle East conflict.
Sending frigates to the Middle East isn't very peaceful, Mr. Hawke.
Janet Gibson, World Tonight.
The first of the telecom evacuees from the Persian Gulf arrived back to Australia tonight. Telecom has evacuated about 140 women and children from Saudi Arabia because of the situation in the Middle East. They arrived in Perth on a flight from London. It is still not known whether King Hussein will enforce a trade blockade against Iraq. President Bush was encouraged by his meeting with the Jordanian king, but not satisfied.
The president's meeting with King Hussein brought no diplomatic breakthrough and no message from Saddam Hussein. Instead, discussions focused on Jordan's compliance or lack thereof with the UN embargo. King Hussein left open the question of whether he would halt shipments of food to Iraq through Jordan's port of Aqaba.
Sir, this is a question of detail. The government is dealing with it.
But the president said the king gave him assurances he would halt Iraqi commerce through Jordan.
I, of course, was very pleased that King Hussein, who previously had announced his support for sanctions, his willingness to go with sanctions, reiterated that to me, making clear that this was a decision that Jordan had taken some time ago.
The president indicated his conversation with King Hussein gave him no indication Iraq is about to back down.
And I did not come away from that conversation with a feeling of hope that Saddam Hussein would do that which he's been called upon to do by under international law.
When asked if there was reason to have hope for a settlement, King Hussein could give no specific reasons why.
I suppose one has to have hope. Without hope, you can't get anywhere. And the dangers are such that it's unthinkable to contemplate the idea of giving up.
It's been a long time since the town of Aqaba was in the news. The last time was during the First World War, when it was a Turkish stronghold and was attacked by the Arab tribes led by the man we know of as Lawrence of Arabia. Well, Aqaba is back in the headlines. It's the weak link in the trade embargo on Iraq, courtesy of Jordan's King Hussein, who's getting a sore bottom from not only sitting on the fence, but from being booted around by both sides.
Hours before the meeting between King Hussein and President Bush, the Jordanian port of Aqaba was still open for business to and from Iraq. It remains a vital lifeline for the beleaguered Iraqis, so the West wants it bottled up. The Jordanians say these lorries are only carrying food and supplies, but the West fears the road could become a conduit for arms shipped in through Aqaba. The Iraqi ship Balkis, loaded with tank parts from Poland, is still in the eastern Mediterranean, destination Aqaba. Analysts think it's waiting for the result of the American talks. And Israeli intelligence claims 2 more armed ships are bound for Aqaba, again playing a waiting game in the Mediterranean. If King Hussein continues to allow the Iraqis to use Aqaba, the port could become a flashpoint with Western ships like the USS Eisenhower intercepting and boarding vessels like the Balkis. Turkey, meanwhile, is keeping its promise to abide by sanctions. 3 Iraqi vessels were refused permission to unload goods in the port of Mersin. They're now anchored offshore, uncertain what to do next. This British supply ship is preparing to set sail from Plymouth to back up the Armilla patrols. It's crewed by volunteers from the Royal Naval Reserve, who are equipped for chemical warfare.
Well, they have individual protection equipment which is issued to them, but the main protection is the citadels, midships and aft, which prevent the ingress of any chemical agents.
The RFA Olna departs to join the ever-growing number of ships in the Middle East.
By the way, if you're wondering whether, in fact, it's all a bit much, this Middle East stuff, and does it really matter, the thing is yes. We're not obsessed with this for the joy of it all. And you might be wondering what has happened, a sort of synopsis, and what perhaps will happen. Professor Springborg will be in a little later to sort of conjecture on what will happen. One of the news stories coming up after this break, balloon pilot Michael Sansby has been held in custody in Perth. Yeah, it's nice. It's Friday. It's been a really long week. Ian, our director, hasn't completely unpacked from his move from Melbourne, which I think is very wise, isn't it? There's a man with ESP. Good old Ian. Good old Ian. One of the original boat people. Someone said, "What do you mean by?" I said, when he was about 1, he comes from another country. His parents put him. They couldn't cope with him any longer. They put him into a little thing, a la Moses. Actually, it was Sri Lanka, and they just pushed him out to sea. And every time he bumped up against another landmass, people started shooting at him. So he's had a rough life before he even joined this channel. But he's a nice bloke. He's a nice bloke. He's one of the few people who eats at the canteen, which is nice for them. What else is happening? I really don't feel like heavy news tonight. I've just about had it. I might have a look on this little piece of paper, which is marked Thursday. We could have played The Pub with No Beer. We could have got, what's his name to come into it? Slim. I do like that song. Oh, yes, our video review. Lethal Weapon 2. I had a look at that during this week and have recovered from it. And what else? Yeah, it's Friday night, and of course, Dick is ready with his program of music to cheer you up and let you forget about the world's problems straight after this. And you might play Hanky Panky with that silly woman. What's her name? Madonna. Is she the original Madonna, is she? I have to put you off religion, isn't she? Well, what sad things are happening in South Africa? They seem to be edging towards some sort of accommodation between blacks and whites. It is now the blacks versus blacks fighting. That's the big worry now. The axes, the spears, and the machetes are taking a vicious toll.
The violence has spread with contagious anarchy, deeper and deeper into South Africa's industrial heartland. Today, it finally came to Soweto. Just outside Johannesburg, the township that has always symbolized a united black resistance was bitterly divided. As Zulus of the conservative Inkatha movement faced off against supporters of Nelson Mandela's African National Congress, with machetes, spears, axes, anything they could find.
We don't want those peoples anymore because they are killing our brothers. We can't even go to work anymore.
The slaughter hasn't stopped for 4 days. We just keep finding more and more bodies, a policeman said. Police have tried to separate the sides and collect their weapons, but ANC leaders claim their tear gas is more often aimed at them. At heart, a battle for political control of the townships. The conflict is increasingly dividing blacks along tribal lines. Many Zulus do not accept Mandela or the ANC's claim that it speaks for the whole black community. With Mandela's credibility so publicly at risk, so are the delicate peace negotiations. Mandela met again with President de Klerk today, but the fire continued to spread. If this is the new South Africa, one black journalist was heard to say, God help us.
Great little world, isn't it? Balloon pilot Michael Sansby is in custody tonight in Perth, while Northern Territory Police arrange his extradition to Alice Springs. Sansby was arrested last night, as we reported, as he was about to board an international flight.
Michael Sansby has been in custody since police intercepted him trying to board a flight to Zimbabwe.
Can you tell us what you're doing at the international airport?
In court today, the former South African was charged with the manslaughter of Anthony Fraser, another pilot killed along with 12 passengers when his balloon and Sansby's collided near Alice Springs last year. Perth police strongly opposed bail, saying it's Sansby's intention to flee the country.
You can see why they call me Captain Kangaroo. There we go, hold on folks.
Sansby had set a ballooning precedent in Australia with his luxury $40,000 balloon, the Euro. Its giant wicker gondola was in constant demand for joy flights across the outback. After the crash, Coroner Dennis Barrett interviewed the pilots of 4 balloons, but Michael Sansby was flying nearest to Anthony Fraser minutes before the accident. This week, the inquest heard allegations that Sansby had deliberately brushed the lower balloon to give his passengers a thrill.
Mayday. Sven, we got a mayday. Sven, we got a mayday.
Tonight, Michael Sansby is in custody while police arrange his return to the Northern Territory. Coroner Barrett is expected to announce on Monday whether Sansby will face manslaughter charges over the other 12 victims. Sandra Falloon, World Tonight.
A little piece of Australian history is no longer with us. Country music writer and singer Gordon Parsons, who wrote The Pub with No Beer, has died at his South Granville home in Sydney's West. He was 64, just 64. The Pub with No Beer was recorded by Mr. Parsons' friend and partner Slim Dusty in 1957, or was it 1958? There is some conjecture there. The song was the only 78 RPM Australian record to go gold. The original recording is still available despite being re-recorded many times. Tom McLean has returned home in his silly bottle. Apparently he has missed his wife.
Tom McLean sailed out of the Sunrise and into the Carrick Roads approaching Falmouth for his first sight of land in 5 long weeks. Tom! His wife Jill was there to meet him. He'd done it again, his 5th unorthodox Atlantic crossing, and he was jubilant.
He's looking in great shape, considering. I didn't know what to expect, really.
Tom McLean hadn't known what to expect either when he left New York 37 days ago. What he got was a lot of bad weather, but that's all over now. Time for a crossing of a different kind.
What am I going to do? Just... Up you go. Up you go. Hang on to that. Hang on to that.
At the second attempt, Mrs. McLean managed to scramble aboard the bottle and crawled carefully to the cockpit for a hug and a kiss. Then they disappeared below. It all went quiet for a while. Flanked by more conventional boats, the bottle steamed gently towards the welcoming committee. The first thing they gave him, another bottle. His sons were there. They'd missed him as he battled with the elements.
I quite enjoyed it, but it's the winds were against me most of the way.
Nice to have him back, Jill.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it was a lovely little British commentator, wasn't it? They were gone for quite a while. Picture of Porthole. Little Boise report that was, wasn't it? Yes. Well, I think he's fairly silly. I mean, what if he got into trouble? Will we have to sort of pay for some people to go in helicopters and what have you? Silly man. Still, he's got some appeal, obviously. Unless they're having a fight. Well, after this brief break, a man who knows a bit about what's going on in the Middle East, he'll give us his thoughts on the subject. If you've been on holidays, you'll be interested to know that Kuwait is in a bit of trouble. The Middle East seems sometimes a long way from Cuba Pedy. But now that our troops are on the way, Hussein is a man we cannot ignore. Professor Bob Springborg from the Middle East Politics Department at Macquarie University will probably find some peace for himself if he actually went to the Gulf. Everyone seems to want to talk to him about what is happening, and so here he is again. Well, really, this is actually our little part of the program where someone comes along with a prominent brain, such as yourself, and talks about their week. So obviously, you've been involved very much with the Middle East, but how has it been for you? With everyone asking you.
It's been a busy week, all right, but it's interesting because this is the world's greatest chess game right at the moment, and the players are moving much faster than we normally see in international chess. Every morning you wake up and the board has a different configuration.
How do you keep in, since it's important for you to be absolutely in touch, where do you get your information from?
One tries to get as many different folks as possible feeding into you. So the diplomatic corps is helpful, both ours and Arab diplomatic corps, other Middle Eastern diplomatic corps. The Americans are helpful. There is a wide range of press available to you in Australia if you subscribe to the press from outside Australia. The electronic media has been very good in its coverage, I think, of the recent events. And then we have a very large Middle Eastern community in Australia. These folks have relatives, they have telephones, they're talking all the time to the Middle East. And so you have a fairly good source, a variety of sources available to you here in Sydney.
Now, you might not agree because it's your job and it's part of my preoccupation. I've been listening to shortwave and I've been obsessed with this to a necessity for about a week. I'm reaching a stage now, I don't know whether it's a psychological problem, where this almost staticness of the whole thing is driving me crazy. It's like waiting on the brink of a cliff. Do you go through that or not?
Well, I tell you, when you follow this thing so closely, every little move of a hair out there, you read a lot into. So the George Bush did not show up to see King Hussein at the airport was already a major thing. And then he kept him waiting there for 24 hours in the hotel. He didn't see him, and he gave this very aggressive speech at the Pentagon while the king was cooling his heels in the hotel. Now, all of that was high drama in the world of diplomacy. So while it looked like nothing was happening, in fact, everything was happening right then.
What about Mr. Bush's treatment of the whole situation?
Well, George Bush started out by being a departure from Reagan. His line was, United States cannot do this alone. This has to be a United Nations effort. It has to be a world effort. We have to stop Saddam jointly because it has been a threat to the post-war world, as his Secretary of State James Baker put it at the time. And that went along for several days, and then the tension began to build in the United States. Some of the calls for blood got a bit loud. The Pentagon, I think, saw an opportunity here to rattle a saber and build up the case for the defense budget, which was just being subjected to the knives in Congress. And so suddenly George dispatched the fleet, and he started building up the military capability unilaterally, without consulting the United Nations, without consulting closely with his NATO partners. And so he went from a man who was very different than Ronald Reagan into what would appear to be a man who was following down the path of Ronald Reagan without quite the same rhetoric, however.
It's curious because, you know, his speech, which we broadcast live, was it last week? I'm getting confused now. I think it was last week. I was waiting for a reference to the oil situation. He made a rough, approximate sort of reference to it in the end by criticising the oil companies in America for putting the prices up. However, the George Bush of yesterday is a man who's only talking about the oil. Now, why has that changed?
Well, we can't forget that, of course, George Bush came to us from the oil industry, so he's got to be a little careful what he says about that.
But he was careful a week ago to barely mention it, but now that's all he's mentioning. Not so much the plight of little countries, but they have got our oil.
Well, I think partly he's worried about the backlash, you see. I mean, it's all right, it's a little country, and it was nasty of Saddam to overrun Kuwait, but Kuwait's a long ways away, after all, and America has a lot on its plate, and should we really be involved in that? I mean, and there is that sentiment in the United States. But when it comes to oil, you're talking about the blood of America. If you've got a 4-ton vehicle going down the road with a 300 cubic inch engine, you're going to be consuming a tremendous amount of that stuff. It's a major expenditure for you. So the price of petrol is directly correlated with the rise and fall of popularity of American presidents.
Now, Professor, getting back to what you alluded to about the fact that Mr. Bush did a Thatcher with the Falklands, immediately dispatched the troops. Is that going to possibly be a negative thing or a trigger for the whole situation? Because it hasn't changed anything really, unless, of course, it stopped them going to Saudi Arabia.
Well, I have the image of all these GIs sitting there in Saudi Arabia in this puritanical country. The GIs who are used to the bordellos in Manila and all the rest, being stuck out there in the desert. Now, how long can we make these GIs suffer on account? I don't mean to be too glib about it. There is a serious problem of juxtaposing the American military to these very conservative countries in the Gulf, and that's a problem in and of itself. Now, there is also the question, the more serious point that you refer to, which is, were the Iraqis going to invade Saudi Arabia or weren't they? This was the justification, after all, for juxtaposing the troops, or putting the troops in. The argument was made on two bits of evidence. One was that some American congressman was talking to Saddam in Baghdad, and Saddam happened to say that he was going to invade Saudi Arabia. This was put out by the United States. Now, the Iraqis immediately denied that Saddam had said any such thing at all, and it seems mad, of course, to imagine that Saddam would be telling a visiting American congressman what he was going to do. The other bit of information was satellite information to the effect that the Iraqis were massing troops in Kuwait, but the on-the-ground observations were that the Iraqis had dispatched earth-moving equipment and were building defensive fortifications along the line there. So, in fact, both bits of information, I think, are highly dubious. I do not believe the Iraqis were intending to invade at all.
Well, then finally, can I put it to you, perhaps the Americans should have waited till they did it?
I think they should have waited exactly. I think even if the Iraqis had gone across that border, the capability they had to drive in those lumbering tanks that they've got would have taken them a few kilometers in before the America had 80 planes at that time on the carrier, which was within striking distance of those tanks. The Americans had further aircraft capability in the near vicinity. They would have taken out those slow-moving tanks before those tanks got anywhere near the oil fields. And so I think it would have been far better politically to keep them out of there.
Yeah, I get that feeling too from reading between the lines. I have one final question I've got to ask you. It's now a month hence from now. What's happening?
Well, we may be back here on another Friday night talking about why things have gone as they have. If the Iraqis can get the Iranians to provide them supplies to prevent the embargo from biting, if this move by Saddam 48 hours ago to heal the rift with Rafsanjani and the Iranians actually works, and the Iranians break the embargo, we could be sitting here a year from Friday night and talking the same thing.
It's going to be an expensive war. A war of nerves, if nothing else.
Well, it's an expensive war. It's $500 million a month for the United States, and it's also expensive for us, too.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Bob Springborg from the Middle East Politics Department in Macquarie University, who has not spent force yet. He is not tired out yet from discussing it. Perhaps I'll just hang in there and we'll see what happens. Let's hope we're not talking in a week's time. Perhaps something will be resolved. For my sake, if no one else's. I'll be back after this. We've just been talking about when I leave this earth, aren't we? How we're going to divide up the spoils. Everyone's volunteering for having things I've got. It's good to see. Nice to have friends. I'm not sorry to go. I'm sure there are others who are not sorry if I go. Hello, Pat. Well, it's a bit cold for the driving at the moment, although it's virtually spring. I mean, the little buds are coming out everywhere. In fact, some of them have come and gone. They just said, oh, that's it then. A lily of a day was fairer far in May. Well, the videotape machine is not a bad way of watching, at least a warm way of watching a new release on tape. Here is this week's escapist fodder, One Man's View. Now, I really enjoyed and continue to enjoy Beverly Hills Cop 1 and 2. They had good characters, great action, and above all, a sense of humour bordering on a spoof. Well, not so Lethal Weapon 2. This story carries on in a loose fashion from the first picture. Mel Gibson is Martin Riggs and his buddy is Danny Glover. The film is very American with an excess of vulgarity, so much so that I found it rather restrictive when selecting some salient scenes. Gibson and Glover are cops. Gibson is real tough and real persistent. He has a party trick which, despite the anguish, eventually saves his life. It also, in the meantime, livens up his workplace.